Ahojte moji milí štvrtáci. Vítam vás asi naposledy z tohto prostredia môjho bytu, pretože nezadržiteľne pracujú všetci na tom, aby ste sa čo najskôr vrátili do škôl. Ak maturantom sa podarí, uvidíme, neviem. Vy už asi viete, lebo ja to nahrávam tradične už oveľa skôr, ako máte hodinu. Nie, čiže vy máte buď 29. alebo 30. apríla, mám ešte len 20. Takže zase som využil len čas, kým sa mi to ešte dá, kým mám pokoj a kľud. V škole ma už budú vyrušovať. No každopádne my sa vrátime do škôl asi čoskoro a ďalšie hodiny, ak nebudete aj vy naspäť v škole, tak budem vám nahrávať už striedy. Dúfam, že to všetko pôjde v poriadku. No vy samozrejme ďalej pracujte na svojich zadaniach, nič sa tam nebude meniť. Písomky aj v prípade návratu ja vám dávať nebudem a budem od vás vyžadovať odovzdanie v podstate týchto zadaní, ktoré máme. No ako viete, tak v podstate ideme ďalej, takže videjka hádam vám fungujú, hádam vám poskytnú dosť informácií na vyplnenie toho, čo máte. Viete sami, že tam máte dosť veľa vecí, pozerať Johnové Greenové videá a možno čítať nejaké recenzie na filmy a takéto rôzne veci. Takže rozdielte si to, prosím, je toho dosť veľa a najmä na tie slovenské zadania, čiže tie rozhovory s vašimi respondentmi, či rodičmi, starými rodičmi, príbuznými, známymi, ja neviem, susedmi, kýmkoľvek to bude ochotný, tak si dajte na to dosť veľa času, lebo tej roboty je dosť. No a samozrejme tí, čo ste sa mi ešte neozvali so známkami, viete, že minulý týždeň bola klasifikačná, takže niektorým tam pribudli napomienky, takže viacerí ste sa mi už ozvali, tí, čo ešte nie, tak vás vyzývam aj teraz, je tam viacerí, ktorí zbytočne by vám tam zostala 4 alebo aká známka strašná, takže ozvíte sa mi, ja vám pridelím referáty podľa toho, čo budete študovať, aby vám to aj niečo pomohlo. Takže bude to väčšinou o dejinách týchto vecí. Dobre, samozrejme otázku som vám už zadal, takže už ste pravdepodobne aj väčšina zodpovedali. Zodpovedajte poriadne, poctivo, poprosím, možno sa to potom aj tak prejaví pri týchto veciach. Dobre, my sme prešli, toto ešte predchádzajúce video, vy ste už medzi tým jedno mali ďalšie. No a my dnes už ukončíme tú studenú vojnu a tie zástupné konflikty alebo dekolonizáciu. No a pôjdeme, ak to vydá, teda cez množstvo obrázkov na také súčasné veci. Ja sa budem zakecávať, ale v podstate to je taký prehľad. No a keď sa nám to podarí ukončiť, pôjdeme už na naše dejiny a tým potom zakončíme v podstate dejepis komplet. Dobre, pozriem sa, či už nemám natiahnuté video, tradične pre druhákov naťahujem, takže ešte nie. Ešte o chvíľku. No a dúfam, že všetko pôjde, takže poďme na to, decka. Previous lesson I ended up while talking about these post-colonial conflicts that are in here. Maybe this would be nice because now you can't see that. Nevertheless, I just named them. So also the part where I ended was Latin America. This is actually an interesting thing for us because the other side of the world, but kind of many things happening with our countries were well known to maybe to your grandparents, including Cuba. Or for example, we used to have a lecturer from Colombia, and I asked him about this FARC, which was a terrorist group and still is in Colombia. Okay, from other conflicts, Latin America is a bit specific because if you remember when we talk about USA, they had this Monroe Doctrine. Since 19th century, they proclaimed that the Western Hemisphere of the globe is their sphere of influence, in which if their interests are somehow endangered, so they are obliged to go and intervene in any way, from diplomatic to embargo to even to military invasion, to military campaign. For that reason, Latin America was developing in kind of specific two forms. First was that countries that cooperated with USA were not very popular because they allowed like rich people to become even richer, and poor people, nobody cared about them, which caused that very often people were rebelling and there were revolutions, but still at the same time there was kind of like long tradition of democracy, or at least attempts for democracy, which causes another thing, that if people are rebelling about the government, that in times of the Cold War is okay for USA, so they try to keep it, and sometimes these rebellions, revolutions, or just elections must be pulled down by some other radical form of government. In this case, coup d'etats in Latin America were, and actually have been even today, either to the right, radical right, or to the radical left. Let's start with radical right, because in this way what happened, the most famous is in Chile, but there are many in Argentina, Brazil, actually almost every single Latin American country probably experience this kind of rule of junta. Junta is a name for military government of like radical right. I wouldn't say they were fascists or something, but the fact is that after the Second World War, thousands of Germans or fascists or Nazi officers and war criminals escaped to Chile, to Argentina, to Uruguay, Paraguay. Adolf Eichmann was kidnapped from Uruguay and kidnapped to Israel by Mossad. And in this way, what happened? So, in the times when there was kind of danger of revolution, probably with mostly with support of USA, this like the army just overruled the streets, and some generals proclaimed themselves to be the presidents. Pardon me. uh, so they proclaimed themselves to be the government of the country. They were pretty like nationalistic, and again they try to help the richer ones and oppress the poorer ones, but on the other hand they sometimes had to do a lot of populistic things, so poor people were not willing to rebel or to go to the streets to demonstrate. On the other hand, they use very often authoritarian and violent methods. I'm sorry, guys, this is again one of my last lessons, so I make a short stop for me, don't worry, not for you. Pardon, decka, ja som späť. Dúfam, že už ma nebude teda chytať záchvat kašľa, je jar a veľa hodín, takže veľa vyučovacích hodín, tak vidíte, niekedy je to náročné. Okay, what I ended up was with this description of military junta. And usually these guys, they just divided the seats in the government. I mean the ministers among the commanders in chief, the general staff. So the president was like this Augusto Pinochet, who was actually lieutenant at the beginning, but then maybe general, whatever. And whereas marshals, and he divided like minister of finances will be this vice general, and general major will be minister of education, and so on. Sometimes they had more ministries at once. So in this way these guys try to rule, sometimes like in order to protect democracy, but on the other hand it was against democracy. So most of the time, just like Augusto Pinochet, they were protecting mostly of free market and capitalism and so on. Very often these military juntas failed with economies, but very often USA helped them with good loans, and that's why sometimes it was not so bad for the country. Especially for this case of Chile, Augusto Pinochet introduced radical libertarian reforms that really helped economy in starting up. But again, the gap between the poor and the rich was even bigger. So Chile today is a country where if you work, you have a good job, you are richer than some other in other countries, let's say Bolivia or Brazil. But if you don't have enough money, you just can't afford to have proper healthcare or good education, and you have no other way how to get out of the country. So this is another case. Of course, Chile is democratic these days since like 1990s, and the differences are not so big, and country got like a good economy. Case of Argentina, Bolivia, many others, Venezuela, almost all of them experience this kind of military juntas, and this terminus technicus is very famous, just as famous as guerrillas. Guerrillas is another word that you may remember from Napoleonic Wars, when Napoleonic France occupied Spain, where army of Kingdom of Spain was destroyed, and people refusing French occupation started to establish small squads of civilians armed by themselves. Of course, didn't clash with open battle with the French, but they were fighting from behind, from the woods, from mountains during the night, doing various attacks on smaller units, smaller troops. or assassinating leaders of their enemies. In this case, this leftist orientation of Latin America caused that very often people who were really poor, so they were willing to listen to these Marxist, Leninist, socialist ideas, and it became really popular about equality and so on. But due to the fact that these countries were democratic and USA was always intervening in these lands, so Latin Americans, those who were left, became more leftist, more in the left, that from our point of view of Europeans, these countries are really radical in this way. There are either people like Bolsonaro in Brazil that is like worse than Trump. He would be compared to like Viktor Orban combined with, I don't know, Maria Kotleba or whoever, and Ulrich, of course. They we need to mention two political parties for them. But on the other hand, their opposition is pretty radical. That they just don't want to, I don't know, increase salaries and increase the taxes for healthcare, but they would actually nationalize oil companies. And of course, why? Because they're in the hands of USA mostly, and USA is the country that prevent them from some more social reform or more socialist reforms. In this way, they prevent those countries from building up, let's say, proper education or proper healthcare, as they saw in Europe, what was happening, let's say, in Poland or Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia. That our countries were not so bad, but again, education and healthcare was not things for everybody, and they saw it that it's possible. So for that reason, very often they voted for kind of people who were populists and leftists and socialists, various forms of these. And again, if USA didn't send their army, so CIA made a coup d'etat, they installed this nationalist government of junta, and so on. And it was this clash in times of military juntas or democratic regime. So even this radical left organized themselves in guerrilla resistance, because jungles of Latin America and mountains of the Andes provide excellent environment for this kind of warfare. Of course, among the first, there was definitely Cuba, in which Fidel Castro, famous dictator in Cuba, firstly failed in first attempt for revolution, pulling down the dictator Fulgencio Batista, installed by USA in Cuba. He failed, but he managed to escape from prison with his brother. And in Mexico, in exile, they met with Ernesto Che Guevara, Argentinian revolutionary, again, like another communist, but a different, I would say, Latin American. They hated this Soviet form of Stalinism, for example. But they came back on small boat and a startup revolution in which even most of the army of Fulgencio Batista joined them. And they entered Havana like with open roads. But of course, if those who fought, so they were executed, they were killed. So these guys like Fidel Castro, they were not like, I would say, Alexander Dubček or like peaceful guys. They were revolutionaries, so killing people too. So even Ernesto Che Guevara and Fidel Castro became very controversial in the way for many people they were saviors, because suddenly nationalized companies in Cuba from America, and they started to build up healthcare, a lot of hospitals and education. And Cubans enjoying a membership in Comecon and support of Soviet Union or Czechoslovakia. So they were doing much better than Haiti or Jamaica in part of Commonwealth. So this was interesting, and even that led the next. It was in 1959. In 1961, USA organized about like 4,000 immigrants from Cuba who embanked in the Bay of Pigs, in the Bay of Swines, and it was kind of a time for counter-revolution. But Cuban Communist Army like struck back, and this Bay of Swines persuaded Fidel Castro they probably should cooperate with Soviet Union, with the Warsaw Pact even more, and they allowed Soviets to install, this is 1959 over my head as you know it, to install missiles with A bombs in Cuba, which is only 150 kilometers from Florida Key West. And that was actually the thing that suddenly Soviets could actually hit USA directly and very quickly. It is not like shooting them from Poland or from Alaska. So this was very close. So what John Fitzgerald Kennedy, American president, immediately did was that he proclaimed blockade of Cuba, embargo, and no ships could enter this wood. And of course, there were Soviet ships carrying these A bombs. So for that time, for a couple of days, Nikita Khrushchev, the chairman of Communist Party Soviet Union, and John Fitzgerald Kennedy were calling on the phone call and negotiating through so-called the hotline, hot telephone line. It's not some erotic stuff, but it is actually talking about whether which of the countries may give up, because still all the time if there was danger that these ships and airplanes start to shoot at each other, they would be counterattack, counter-strike, and they would launch all the missiles, and there would be third nuclear war. And that times for a couple of weeks our Czechoslovak People's Army, so maybe you may met with the guys who were serving in 1962 in the military, in the army, so they were prepared for war for all the 2 weeks. They couldn't like get shoes off. The Cuban crisis actually ended up that uh, when USA promised to uninstall their launchers, missile launchers from Turkey, that was member of NATO and on the borders with Soviet Union, and for that reason, Soviets did it too, uninstalled it. That promised not to do that in Cuba. Actually, Americans didn't fulfill the promise, and still these missiles and launchers are there in Turkey. And I think 1 or 2 years ago, Turkey asked USA to uninstall them because they are already rusty, and probably there may be leakage of some uranium. So that's still the thing, the point. So you see, negotiation diplomacy is really kind of a warfare without weapons, as one Prussian general said in the 19th century. Ernesto Che Guevara became the symbol of these guys. He was Argentinian doctor, physician, and he was kind of idealistic guy who believed that there may be equality. And when he was young man, he traveled across all Latin America on a motorcycle, and he saw a lot of poverty there, and he became like Marxist communist by refusing the Stalinist regime. On the other hand, still radical. What I've told you, that many people, and it's really different, weird for us to listen to their ideas. They would be really radical, like no difference between USSR. Even he was like on worn on T-shirts, on the flags, but at the same time he killed like many innocent soldiers who were giving up, and he did it. He shoot them only to make this terror within the country. So Cuba, despite for many people, that was ideal. It was actually poor country with totalitarian regime, just like any other. Actually, there were many movements, and from those I picked up Sandinistas. Sandinistas were behind my head. It's that was movement in Nicaragua, and these guys, again, like Che Guevara, had this guerrilla warfare for the liberation from American influence. Bad thing for them, they were not so radical, but they needed to finance their forces somehow, and they found it actually the support in Colombia, because they actually make agreement with Pablo Escobar, famous narco baron, that they can open their country for the transport of cocaine to USA, which caused, of course, that Nicaragua then became like transport country, and thus a target even more for US operations. And for about 10 years, Sandinistas were fighting in the rainforests and the jungles of Nicaragua, but they were actually oppressed. And Nicaragua even today is like poor country with any results around here. Even in Mexico, that we haven't mentioned it for many years, with big influence with USA, defeated a couple of times in 19th century by USA. So in the south there is a state of Mexico called Chiapas, and here in Chiapas there is actually deliberation struggle of Native Americans who organized themselves in anarchist and communist armies called Zapatista army, and they are wearing these black and red flags and scarves and these like baseball caps, and they're actually poor American Mexican Indians, like, and nobody supports them, but they fight because white landholders are taking their lands, forestry companies are cutting their woods, and America is supporting this government because they are liberal, they are capitalist, they are democratic, but at the same time there is this greed. Pursuit of happiness is still there. So when I finally eventually asked this my friend, our colleague Hector Bedoya from Colombia, from Medellin, of course, about Pablo Escobar and all this stuff, he was actually growing at those years when Pablo Escobar was there, and talking about how people loved him because nobody took care about like poor people. And Pablo Escobar was that's why so successful, because he invested plenty of money back to his slums, to these favelas, which are poor neighborhoods, when people didn't have anything. And he built like football pitches there, he built hospitals and schools, and people loved him for that, because who got poisoned? Americans, fat gringos somewhere in the north, who for all the history of Colombia were interfering not to allow these leftist governments. Pablo Escobar was not a leftist, because he himself, he had a war against these guerrillas, which caused that some part of Colombians, including the sector, was actually supporting it, and they rose in the power. So you got three fractions in Colombia: government, that was democratic, but at the same time supported by USA, and trying to keep democracy as much as it gets, not to become the break for junta, for some junta. Then there were these narco barons fighting each other, and then there were leftists, and these guys went to the woods, to the mountains, and they start to fight against government, against Pablo Escobar, and even against Americans. And Pablo Escobar was killed. So they keep on fighting against the government, and in the way that when American tourists came to see Colombia, so they just kidnapped them, hijacked them, not hijacked, but kidnapped them, and asked for ransom. These guys were called FARC, and this was like Forza Armada Revolucionaria de Colombia. Uh, these guys were never terrorists, but they had some conflicts, and actually even Pablo Escobar and government were fighting against them. So I asked Hector about what does he think about these guys, because a couple of years ago they're going to give their arms down and stop, quit fighting. So he said, like, actually they're cool guys. They are just kidnapping these fat white tourists, and that's all. And actually, I support their ideas, because they want to keep their country for natives, for indigenous people, and without influence of America. So these are still kind of interesting things to think about. That you may have influence of some or other country, for Cuba Soviets, for Colombia Americans, but still, not accepting local conditions, introducing their form of government may be really bad. So what Americans finally understood was, when Pablo Escobar was gone, it was not the end of the TV series, and actually the trade with cocaine. So in this way, America realized that instead of Pablo Escobar, there are 10 more narco barons with even more money, and Mexicans and so on. So the only way they can do is really to improve the life of the people in Colombia, and in the way they don't need to be in the service of these narco barons. They can just make they open businesses and startups, and they can farm in their land, and it can be not only environmentally but even politically correct and fair and justice. And really, Colombia, in many countries, when I had some disputes last days, so Americans actually give up this policy of Truman Doctrine and Monroe Doctrine in Latin America, and rather they supported kind of development programs like European is doing here in Eastern Europe, with building up democracy, and also enough capital, enough money that can be distributed to education and for everything. So even Medellin became like town from like dangerous city to one of the best cities in Latin America, with a lot of universities and great life. Interesting things, I would say. Let's have a look at many pictures that I have in here, because for me it was really difficult to show you. Maybe to have some timeline or chart of all these events. Maybe chart would be nice one. May have to think about it, or maybe to give. Actually, you have charts in your assignments, and this is point of view what I wanted to tell you. So just writing down Colombia and Cuba and so on. So from the pictures, from all this kind of take it as a revision that is with visual, with pictures. So if we were in the lesson, you would be raising your hands, or we had a Microsoft Teams lesson, that you would be shouting out who's in the picture and giving, like, I would give you the good points. So we are not doing that. So Ho Chi Minh was the chairman of Communist Party of Vietnam and the leader of this independence warfare. And this is the thing that even Vietnam became communist. Of course, they had these authoritarian regimes and so on, but they didn't have these like labor camps. Actually, the first events I heard where these 2 3 years ago, when Slovakia helped them to kidnap one of the dissidents of Vietnam, journalists. So Ho Chi Minh still being celebrated like in China, but I would say that compared to Mao Zedong, much better guy in this way. Even Ho Chi Minh's army invaded to Cambodia to pull down Pol Pot's regime of Khmer Rouge after they killed 2 million people wearing glasses. This picture may be familiar to you because you may see American soldiers with UH-1 helicopters dropping paratroopers or Marines. That's war in Vietnam, of course. Better resolution, infamous, a famous photo of kids running away from their village, burning after the napalm bombs hit the land. Actually, they were saved by American soldiers and they all survived. But this showed the terrors of war, especially in USA. Of course, for Soviet bloc, for us, it was like no normal thing that imperialists are killing, well, like kids, in the somewhere in the third world in Asia. But for Americans, it was kind of reveal, like enlightenment. And suddenly, what we are doing there? Dropping like napalm, Agent Orange on kids? That was true. Happened. That happened. So that caused like big peaceful movement and so on. So that for that reason, even Vietnam finally won. Americans were defeated, just like from Afghanistan. They're going to withdraw together our army with them, and that would be another war that Americans had actually lost. That's why Ho Chi Minh now in black, not colored photo lived until days. Actually, he didn't live until the end of the war for the defeat of Americans, but being celebrated. Another guy is this one in the picture is Augusto Pinochet, and typical figure of Chilean military junta rolling in here. What I have realized that for in the past years, past several years, even young boys, many time like educated guys, are making like jokes about dropping communists from helicopters to the ocean, to Pacific Ocean full of sharks. That was the way how Augusto Pinochet dealt with the opposition, not only communists, any leftist or anybody who actually criticizes undemocratic regime was taught not in concentration camp but in special camps in football stadium in Santiago de Chile. Here in this football stadium in 1962, Czechoslovakia was playing finals of the World Championships against Brazil with Pelé. We lost, and 5 or 7 years later, suddenly this became place where these opposition to Augusto Pinochet junta were gathered, Chilean soldiers with American weapons, and one by one they were taken for investigation, and many of them were taken to helicopter, which led over the Pacific Ocean, and it came back without that. They were just dropped to the ocean where they were killed by sharks or they drowned, and in this way, about like several thousands of people were executed. That may sound funny, but in this way, if you use this kind of violence against your enemies, your moral is the same. Like, what's the difference? Czechoslovaks, they execute in Czechoslovak communists, they executed about like 400 people. And Augusto Pinochet, maybe 4 or 5 thousand. I'm not sure about how many of them. So this became actually very different. And you know what was interesting thing? Americans supported Augusto Pinochet, even including United Kingdom of Margaret Thatcher. For her, he was a guy who stopped communists in nearby surrounding countries, even here in Chile. They allowed the British and American companies to make business in Chile, in mines and in ports and harbors and so on. So until the end of the Cold War, Pinochet's regime was still there. And just like in South Africa, apartheid or the Vietnam War became like infamous for this democratic but capitalistic world. So try to tell them that it's good. And that's why, for that reason, every year women who were relatives to all these guys who were killed didn't, as I said, they could be communists or just leftists or journalists were writing against Augusto Pinochet. It's undemocratic, and they were like executed or imprisoned, whatever. And women are and their relatives are marching all the time with big photos of their relatives. If you see even some women around. Okay, so that's case of Chile and so on. Another picture that we had Middle East, from Israel and Palestine. I didn't show you many of them. Was building the wall after like in early millennium 2000 that separates Palestinian territories from Israeli, which is actually occupied by Israel. Okay, this guy was supporting kind of decolonization process in Africa, but while supporting, let's say, Palestinian terrorists or Iranian terrorists if they decided to bring revenge upon Americas and so on. His name is Muammar Gaddafi, and he became dictator in Libya, which is one of the richest countries for oil in Africa. He managed to use this money and Soviet weapons to unite these Libyan various tribes and clans fighting each other and invested all this oil money into excellent healthcare and building up power plants. Actually, many Slovaks were working in Libya as kind of development programs and so on. That's why many people, if you ask them about Libya who are older, they say, well, that was cool country because suddenly Africa showed what is there. But this guy, he used his money also when some Palestinian or Iranian terrorists kidnapped airplane with civilians. So he allowed them to land in Tripolis, in the capital of Libya, and he provided them exile. He was financing terrorist groups in Western Europe, IRA, ETA, for example. So on one hand, he was a guy leader of African nations for decolonization with the help of Soviets. But of course, being too controversial, and he has his bodyguards were only girls around, like pretty African girls around, and on the other hand, he used this money also for his people, that they're really rich. Libyans are rich, just like this Qatar or Saudi Arabia. On the other hand, he was supporting this terrorism and so on. So difficult to say. Actually, he survived even Cold War and he ended up with Arabic Spring on rise about like 2011, 2009. Okay, let's see some more pictures. Okay, this is some of the marches of Cuban communists, probably one of the celebrations. Fidel Castro was wearing uniform, this green jungle uniform for all his life. Typical hat with shield is still called Castroca today. Ernesto Che Guevara in the middle marching. Raul Castro marching in here. This ruling in Cuba today, which was actually a big surprise for me that Americans didn't try to invade Cuba and install the government. Probably they believe that it's okay, but that was case of Barack Obama that he said that maybe economy and open market and connections with tourism may help move Cubans to move there. But Cubans know that it's pretty difficult to get like to good healthcare and education in USA. So many people actually rather live in poverty. That was case of Czechoslovakia. If you ask them about socialism, these memories like yeah, it was nice. We were all equal. We had flags, and yeah, we didn't have like oranges from Cuba. They were yellow. Oranges very sour, but they felt like safe. That is what Robert Fico was talking about: social securities, sociálne istoty. A Cuban flag, but with Ernesto Che Guevara, his photo from. One funeral was being printed like this way, and even Andy Warhol used this kind of uh, making black or white and contrast colors in case that it was very easy to print and or to paint, and it was on the t-shirts and it became actually fashion symbol. Ernesto Che Guevara was not very happy about this Cuban crisis. One of the pictures, the American marine reconnaissance airplanes checking Soviet ship transporting something to Cuba. Yeah, it could be anything, even Czechoslovak TV sets or radios, but even uranium, A bombs, whatever in here. So he was not very happy about these things, and actually he started to criticize Fidel Castro and decided to leave Cuba. He traveled all around the world, visited Czechoslovakia a couple of times, but then he decided to organize warfare in Africa, in Congo against Belgians, then in Angola to support the local communists in the fight against South Africa. Actually, Fidel Castro sent him even army, so there was Cuban regular army fighting in Angola against apartheid regime of South Africa. So if you ask people who is the good guy and bad guy, so it's I'm not wondering that people are confused because it's sometimes really difficult to tell it, to say it. Then he moved to Bolivia, but here in Bolivia he didn't have enough support of locals, and finally his group was only like 12 people with a couple of rifles but no bullets. And he was hunted by thousands and hundreds of Bolivian army soldiers and even CIA agents. Finally, he was captured by Bolivians, and while they were celebrating, Ernesto Che Guevara was bound to a chair. And when they got drunk, one of the sergeants came and he just shook him to the head. So even this revolutionary who started criticize Fidel Castro for being pro-Soviet, pro-Stalinist, like being the victim of this bipolar Cold War and not decolonization war of the third world, third world. Sorry, so he was executed like Jesus, like martyr. That's why he's like so popular personality for Lubos Blah, but even for many others. And maybe he just don't deserve it because many people are killing the others. He was not regular army man, so he was not a hero. But for leftist government, definitely. Okay, and this picture, this famous cartoon, you've already seen it. John Fitzgerald Kennedy arm wrestling with Nikita Khrushchev sitting on hydrogenium bombs, prepared to push the buttons. And as I told you about the result. Still, this is Ayatollah Khomeini, Iranian highest priest uh, of Shia Islam in Iran. And Iran is a republic with president after the revolution that pulled down. I didn't tell you this actually interesting stories from the last year. History Karevi had good monothematic volume. About Iran itself, and Iran as a Persia, former Persia, was a country that was neutral for many years. But in 1950s, as a kingdom with Shah, that's the title of the Persian or Iranian king. Yeah, it gave name to chess in other languages. So this government was actually pulled down by coup d'état that prepared free elections. And in 1950s, Iranians lasting for democracy, but at the same time for kind of equal regime, elected the political party of Prime Minister Mossadegh. This guy Mossadegh realized that they cannot make these reforms when all the oil industry, oil resources are in the hands of British companies and partially American companies. That's why he proclaimed nationalization, just like President Nasser did nationalization of Suez Channel. He did wanted to do it with all companies in Iran. But Americans made a coup d'etat in which CIA pulled down Prime Minister Mossadegh, who was later killed, assassinated, and they reinstalled, they restored this rule of Shah, of Iranian Shah. This regime was kind of so-so. They tried to support people, but gradually the Iranians realized they have nothing from this old well. They have no democracy because Iranian Shah was persecuting everybody who was against him, from Islamists to communists, from Democrats to right wing, whatever. And that's why they started the revolution in 1970s, that want to become, because when people got radical in this way, no communism were possibly, no, well, some junta, but this Islamistic Islamism was popular. So they start to be supported by this Ayatollah, and people went out to the streets and they actually pulled down this Iranian Shah. USA tried to stop it with another coup d'etat, but it completely failed, and people in the streets were just destroy any attempts to paratroopers. Even they attacked embassy, from which Americans barely escaped. And thus Iranian proclaimed their own Iranian Islamistic Republic, in which you have president, you have elected government, even women have voting right, but every single law must be approved at the end, not by the president. He had to approve it, sign it up, but by the highest council of ayatollahs, of the highest priests. So no law can be approved, can be passed without approval of this. So Iran is a country that seems to be modern in some parts. Women are wearing jeans there, for example. They have to wear scarves. but people are common. They have internet, TV, and everything. But there is very strict regime. Actually, still in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in Oman, it's there. And these countries were supported by Americans. So let's deal it. And Iran thus became like enemy of both of Soviet Union and even of America at the same time. That's why when it got into war against Iraq, that used to be supported by France and Soviet Union, but it stopped being after this using of chemical weapons. So the result was that with Saddam Hussein fighting Ayatollah Khomeini in the war of Iraq-Iran were not supported by anybody, by nobody. Because, for example, for Al Qaeda, for Taliban, these guys were bad because they were Shia and not Sunnites. And Saddam Hussein, he was only military dictator. He was oppressing everybody. If he had captured Osama bin Laden, for example, he would have executed him. But tell it to Americans in 2001. For that reason, even Yasser Arafat actually changed his policy. If you remember what I was talking about in Palestine resistance movement, that they rather move to kind of peaceful negotiations that can bring these countries into peace with different way. Still, Europe didn't manage to survive. When the Cold War was over, Saddam Hussein survived, Ayatollah survived, Yasser Arafat changed opinion, but it came back. But for example, in Yugoslavia, things changed into terrible conflict among Southern Slavic nations in here. What a contrast with another personality, Robert Schuman in 1950's. That was the one I read the part about establishment of community of coal and steel. That was the beginning of European Union. So the ways how it can be solved, and we come to the end of the Cold War. It's sweet 1990s, for which I have to check out my time. Okay, 90 minutes exactly. So let's pass it. I will see how long it lasts. I can tell you many things about this. The point was that it was the end of the Cold War. In 1990s, Germany was reunited, democracy came to Czechoslovakia, Poland, and so on. Soviet Union was dissolved into 15 states. Learn them because it's really important to understand who they are, what are their languages, their ethnicity, their religion. Because this is also the war between Ukraine and Russia that was there in Crimea, and maybe it will come back one day. In Chechnya, in between Azerbaijan and Armenia, for example. Okay, so there are many things that we actually should know and should understand. Also, with the Persian Gulf War that followed, that Saddam Hussein, after the defeat, not defeat, but actually kind of draw between Iran and Iraq, so he invaded Kuwait. And Kuwait was saved by a coalition of many countries, including Russia and USA and Czechoslovakia together. From one year to another, they changed from enemies to allies. On the retreat, Iraqi army set all these oil towers on fire, which is that it can be eternal flame. So the only way how to kill the fire is to come as close as possible, throw some explosive to the hole, and the explosion just exhausts all the oxygen around, which makes this hole like stuck. And also with landslide in here, but took a couple of years when all these burning things were done in here. Okay, what else? It seemed to be like really cool days for Europeans, because that was these winds of change as German band Scorpions were playing. Democracy was coming, but at the same time, big social insecurity with unemployment, dissolution of states. What I told you about this Yugoslavia is that the fall of the regime was different, because we were glad, or most people were glad, that communism, socialism fell in Czechoslovakia or in Poland. But in Yugoslavia, it was not so bad, not so hard for the people. So it was quickly replaced by nationalism among these states. And Yugoslavia is a federation of 6 states. And in this way, they start to argue and fight among each other. We side firstly with Albanians in Kosovo, for which Yugoslavian army deployed their weapons and actually violently oppressed them. So that was not such a big deal, but at that time Albanians turned into more radical form, because there are Muslims that will be supported by Saudi Arabs or these guys. Only 1 year later, this nationalism that quickly replaced the socialism rose so much that people start to show off their religion even more and be angry about the other religions and other stuff, especially in Bosnia and Serbians, where Serbians are Eastern Orthodox, as you know, or you all know, with all with the Muslims in Bosnia and Catholic Croatians who start to fight each other in a couple of phases of war. You have also assignment tasks for this. So again, be sure you know all the nations and their confessions because if you travel to Croatia, but even more in Slovenia, especially Serbia, you can understand many words, and these people are really close to us. Watching this war on TV in our news made Czechs and Slovaks willing to make agreement without any fighting, any conflict. Rather have like not like equal division, but rather it must be peaceful. With no even referendum can cause nationalism among the members of Slovenská národná strana, Slovak National Party. It can cause conflicts. So just like these days, Russians can be really like can have some bad feelings. Not all Russians are the same. Not all of them. It's not Russian propaganda. It's Kremlin propaganda. It's Putin propaganda. So this is the thing that even Czechs would be felt like bad in Czechoslovakia. So and we are among the few, not Hungarians. They cannot understand it unless they speak Slovak, English. Poles are too far away. And they were Catholics, but Czechs and Slovaks, as most like not multi-religious countries or a non-religious country, they could understand them. And actually in civil war we supported even Croatians, even Serbians, both. So they never forget about this, and they liked us for that reason. We can be the bridge. That's why Miroslav Lajčák was deployed and appointed as ambassador of European Union in Bosnia and Herzegovina after the war ended up to make agreement among them. He could veto decisions of their parliament and the presidents of Bosnia and Herzegovina. But terrible things which were there caused that these things that other countries may be dissolved this different way. The same with Soviet Union, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania separated in peaceful way, but not Chechnya. We're not allowed to do that. Ukraine, there was no war, but war is last years. So in Donbass and Luhansk around. Of course, dissolution of Czechoslovakia came, not the year, don't confuse Slovakia with Slovenia. This is a recommendation for your friends abroad. European Union project started to be raised again. And this is the thing, once the Berlin Wall was over, what to do with East Germany? Is it obviously when they reunited, are they part of European Union? They had to pass many reforms in Eastern Germany, and people again felt the same things like in Czechoslovakia. That's why the neo-Nazi parties or populist parties are the only places where they are popular in Germany is Eastern Germany, former DDR. So this is interesting, and creation of European Union in 1991 made chance for Spain, for Austria, for Portugal, and soon, even after 12 years, even for us. And no borders among us is great idea. They can prevent all the things. Imagine that if Yugoslavia immediately entered the European Union, for Serbians, Croatians, Bosniaks, there would be no reason to fight, to kill each other. That's why the only way how to stop all these ethnic differences is kind of this project where everybody is equal and there are preserved not only political and human rights but even language rights or religious rights. Nobody can proclaim and follow persecuted for that reasons. Just like in Bosnia Herzegovina, Radovan Karadzic, for example, many, many others. You got a whole bunch of personalities in there. Ongoing conflicts in 1990s was in Persian Gulf with this war in Kuwait. Then in 1990s, American Hollywood movies and comedies had the main ultimate enemy with Saddam Hussein and Charlie Sheen killing him. Israel-Palestine was still fighting until mid-90s. If you remember, there was this short peace between them, but after the fall of the twins, it was restored. Chechnya, there were terrible wars of Russia against this autonomous region, and finally they were solved in the way that eventually Russians installed their president that is ruling with iron fist in Chechnya and tried to invest a lot of money so they cannot complain. Just like in Tibet. We had a colleague also, she was great, she was teaching in China for 5 years. And she said, but yeah, it's sad with Tibet, but Chinese invested so much money that Tibetans cannot complain about anything, about their religion. Try to guess. One of the very sad stories of 1990s was genocide in Rwanda, in which ethnic differences between Hutu and Tutsi ethnic groups caused terrible genocide. About 700 men were killed with machetes. And today, Rwanda is a country with the highest amount of women in politics because there were almost no men left, and they tried to overpass this heritage of terrible war. And at the time, United Nations or America or Blue Helmets or NATO were not able or willing to intervene and stop it because there was no oil, I don't know, no military interest. For that reason, even still, there were some terrorist groups going on since 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Now, in these 1990s, not being supported by Soviet Union anymore, but still working. That was IRA, Irish Republican Army, still fighting for many years. The Cranberries band with Dollars a Real Deal were singing this song Zombie about this war. U2 with Bono Vox. With Bono Vox was singing Sunday Bloody Sunday, all about this Irish War of Independence and terrible terrorism. That caused also terrorist attacks from the other side, from UDA. That was Unionist Defense Associational Army. That was Anglican fighting or Protestant, Orangist fighting this Green Catholic IRA. So walking Belfast, you could see these wall paintings all around. Now, do you know when they quit fighting? When Ireland and United Kingdom entered the European Union because suddenly there was no border. When there was Brexit, so everybody, even including me, were afraid like, what if these terrorist attacks start again? And they started. Already some people were killed there. So this is really sad about these things and make like separate and not being like this multicultural globalized world. Of course, for some people it can be bad thing. But in this case, I can remember, and many people can remember how when it ended up. The same thing is with ETA. Euskadia ta Askatasuna was name of Basque terrorist organization in northern Spain. Basque land is just like Galicia or Catalonia were autonomous regions of Spain that really suffered during Franquist fascist regime that ended up until 1970s. Already in 1960s, this ETA started to organize because they could not challenge Spanish Franquists in open warfare, so start to organize terrorist attacks with kidnapping politicians, attacking police stations, offending, of course, King of Spain, and so on. Even when Spanish government was building democracy, ETA was still fighting because Spain was not very much willing to give them autonomy. But later on, if when Spain asked to enter European Union, they told them, but you have to give even minority rights, and in case if they ask for autonomy, give it to them, and it will stop terrorist attacks. And it did. When I asked, we had also one partnership, Comenius School from Bilbao, which is actually the capital of Basque land, and I asked them about it. I said, they are like nationalist, crazy MFs, and nobody supports them because they only kill people. And instead of political attempts to bring independence is different. But Catalonians are doing that. And when Spain has liberal or leftist government, they do it, but they have conservative, just like with Trump and Brexit and all this populism happening all around. So they start to actually to limit language rights in Catalonia, in Basque land, same. Nobody says about restoration of ETA, thanks God. But Catalonia got a big problems, in here. Among the terrorist groups, because Palestinian terrorism actually fell down gradually, Wahhabist Islamistic terrorism was still there, but mostly in Africa, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan. But nobody was watching that, and their leaders, Osama bin Laden with Al Qaeda, it made him very angry, and he thought that we had to prepare attack that nobody would like forget about it. Still, there was terrorist warfare in Asia. Case of India, Pakistan, or Sri Lanka. LTT, Liberation Tigers of Tamil Elam, was actually I believe Hinduistic group with partially Buddhist members fighting against Islamistic terrorist groups in Sri Lanka and Ceylon. So as you see, that was really difficult to surpass all these things, and I got only 6 minutes. So let's move on very quickly. Compare the maps. It's a map of the Persian Gulf, map of Yugoslavia of communist times. When I remember, I had no ideas about Slovenia, Macedonia, and their differences. But this is ethnic map of this country, and it's not so exact because even in Bosnia it's really mixed up. In every valley, in every town, it's really different. They were mixed families and so on. But this is what finally eventually came to be in these days, with all these countries. In Macedonia to change its name, Kosovo sees independence, but we are among several countries that refused to accept the existence of Kosovo because it was only one way proclamation of independence with support of USA and Western countries. But Spain refused it because of Basque Catalonia. We refused it because of Hungarians would claim it. Russia because Serbians had been always their friends. But this is Europe. 2012 at that time was different. This European these days with more members, and I would say that project is really worthy to keep because we may have like history of conflicts during the history. End of dreaming, as I call it. 2001, 11 September 2001, I came back from Banska Bystrica from university, coming home. And I opened TV, and Janka Hospodarova on TV Markiza was scared, pale, and she was scared. And they saw about attacks. They were all shocked, and they said, "Suddenly, you got another airplane coming." They switched to CNN Live, and I saw how there is burning twin tower of the World Trade Center WTC buildings burning, and another airplane is hitting and bombing. I saw this live on TV. My sister was in USA at the time, in Colorado Springs. People watching it in a big hotel, and people pull guns, start to shoot because they believe they are under attack of Palestinian terrorists. Immediately there were CNN subtitle going that maybe IRA, maybe ETA. They just were looking for any terrorist who would be willing and capable of doing this. In a couple of days, it revealed that there were 5 airplanes kidnapped by Al Qaeda. That was this small terrorist Wahhabist Islamistic group attacking in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, and in Kenya, in Nairobi. But because they were not so successful, so their leader, Saudi Arabic millionaire Osama bin Laden, trained for many years with this man to kidnap airplane, to control them, and to hit the main targets of U.S. military and government. The power is hidden in the money. That's why World Trade Center was their heart of the economy of the United States. Two airplanes hit the targets, killed about 3,000 people, but estimated numbers in the first seconds were 50,000 men. Actually, my second cousin is American. He's living only 10th skyscraper from here. We were immediately calling him. He answered after 2 weeks from some center or some school somewhere else that he actually lost some of his friends in there, and they couldn't. Were no telephones working in New York for many days. Actually, one of the airplanes hit Pentagon, which is a famous building of Ministry of National Defense of USA. One airplane was completely lost, and the other airplane fell in the woods of Pennsylvania, where probably, and according to the black box that is actually orange in airplane and records the course of the flight, realized the flight attendants and the crew and passengers just start to fight with terrorists and rather pull down airplane down than to be hit and killed, like in Lockerbie, Scotland, when Palestinian terrorists or Iranian terrorists kidnapped the airplane. Subsequently, new president after Bill Clinton, Republican George W. Bush, second George Bush, started very aggressive and paranoid, fear fearful in politics of America, that started a couple of wars in Iraq that had no reason, in Afghanistan, because at the time Osama bin Laden was hiding in Afghanistan, but they finally captured him when Barack Obama became president, and they had news that he's hiding in Pakistan. But hunting and finally capturing Osama bin Laden would cause them that American armies can withdraw from Pakistan and Iraq, especially Iraq. They didn't want to leave it. Al Qaeda suddenly rose with numbers, and Islamism started on the rise, the Islamophobia started on the rise, which caused another wars, another terrorist attacks. In London, for example, a matter of only 3 days, our school trip from university left Madrid, so there were bomb attacks in underground in Madrid, and these aggressions and fear of Islam cause another aggressions, another conflict. So that's why there was another task to compare policy on the George Bush Jr. and Barack Obama administration. Okay, I have only 1 minute, guys, so I will show you only a couple of pictures that are in here and maybe show this thing. So George Bush Jr. or George W. Bush as a fireman, piece of cake, the fire of terrorism, but Iraqi war is not the way how can kill the fire, and suddenly terrorism got rise on hill. Many people couldn't understand me at the time. They told me that I'm anti-American, pro-Russian, I don't know, pro-Islamistic today. I'm pro-American, anti-Russian, I don't know, whatever. So it depends, you know. Still in Holy Quran, there is actually about killing people, complete things, and only crazy priests can explain it in the way that it's symbolic, and even jihad must be real, must be killing people. That's it's not true. Only small sects are in there, but it depends. When there is no highest authority about Islam, so some priests can be really crazy, you know. So just like Christianity and anything else. Thatcher Reagan supported Bin Laden, and yeah, this is they thought Bin Laden was a freedom fighter in Afghanistan, the Soviet Union, and Nelson Mandela was a terrorist. Just the result of the Cold War, still in the way that even today, USA, not all Muslims are hateful that you see in TV. Not all Christians are hateful, because this is how people in Iraq, in Afghanistan can see that we, even Slovak army was there, and why we were there. You know, we are also responsible for this thing. So also the thing I want to do is to know the foreign policy review of each American president, their administration, since Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, with all these lines of this John Fitzgerald Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, former actor in cowboy movies, George Bush, Bill Clinton, George Bush, the second junior, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and now Joe Biden in here. So all the lineage of presidents in here, but they are not all, obviously. Or are they? Or are they all? I'm not sure. I have to check it out. Okay, guys, that's all from me. And the next lesson we are going to finish the these days new millennia, year 2000. And I'm after this lesson we move and switch to Slovak history in the 20th century. Okay, so the age of yours, guys, when you were born is the end. So that's all from me. Maybe we will see each other in the at school. We will see. I don't know. So have a nice day, guys. Stay negative in test and positive in mind. Bye bye.